Welcome back to Fossil Ridge Games. Today's topic is going to be Groot, specifically for Marvel Champions, a living card game. I'm going to walk you through how to play Groot. I'm also going to walk you through some deck building strategies for Groot. And then finally, I'm going to walk through something a little bit unique. And this topic is going to be alternate types of resource management for your decks for Marvel Champions living card game. Alright, our deck building guide is going to begin with a basic overview of Groot so you understand how he works, how he functions, and that way you can make better decks. So first we're in his alter ego mode, and he has a skill called Growth Spurt, and this can only be done once per round. And you can put 2 growth counters on Groot, so I'm just going to go ahead and simulate that. So opening turn, when you're in your alter ego mode or form, don't forget to throw down those 2 growth counters. His recovery is pretty decent at a 4. Next, when you flip over, he has a forced interrupt. When Groot would take any amount of damage, remove that many growth counters from him. For each counter removed that way, prevent 1 point of damage. The point of this is that this is a forced interrupt. So if Groot takes any amount of damage, you don't really have a choice. You have to take these counters off first. Okay, so you're going to take these off. Let's say, for instance, Groot suffers 3 points of damage. I'm going to take off 2 of these growth counters. That's going to absorb 2 points of damage, and then Groot is going to take 1 point of damage. So kind of the name of the game for Groot is resource management. We're going to constantly be wanting to put out these growth counters. Now, the other thing that's kind of difficult about Groot is that a lot of his cards require growth counters. So in all, there's a total of 9 cards in his hero deck that require growth counters to even use. So let's say you have 0 growth counters, you won't be able to use 9 of those cards, 9 of those hero cards in your deck. Consequently, his deck contains 6 cards, 6 cards total, that let you add growth counters to him. So the name of the game with Groot is be very mindful anytime he's going to take damage, because it could really take the steam out of your sails, so to speak. You're going to lose a lot of your momentum in the game. It's going to take a while to build up those growth counters. It's easy to lose the growth counters, and it's a lot harder to build them. First off, there's a card, it's a support called Fertile Ground. You can only use it when you're in your alter ego form. You can exhaust this to add a growth counter to Groot and draw a card. This is great, but you know, as with all of the heroes when you're playing this game, you don't want to spend a lot of time in your alter ego form because the villain's going to scheme and you're going to lose the scenario. Next up, there's 2 copies of Fruition. It's a very easy card to play, 0 cost event. You put 2 growth counters on Groot, and you know, one of the consistent themes is Groot can never have more than 10 growth counters on him. That would be pretty amazing if you could get 10 growth counters on him. I played this numerous times. I got up to 7 numerous times, but it just seems like you can't really get close to that 10. Next up, we have this Root Stomp. This is a great sort of ability. It is probably one of my favorites in the deck because it has a dual purpose. First and foremost, I don't have to spend growth counters to use it, but I can hit something for 5 points of damage. And if I defeat that enemy, I can place a growth counter on Groot. So use these cards to whittle down and annihilate minions. If you wipe out a minion, then you get a growth counter on Groot, which is fantastic. Groot has a full set of versatile upgrade support cards. And what makes these fun is that all of his basic abilities, whether it's thwart, attack, or defense, you can spend growth counters to enhance that for the turn. So it makes Groot extremely versatile. The downside is you can't use these cards at all if you run out of growth counters. My favorite one is the defensive one called Vine Shield. Now, the name of the game for Groot is to keep the growth counters on him. So anytime you need to defend, go ahead and do so. You can spend 1 growth counter to add a +3 defense to him. He already starts with a 3 defense. You're going to raise that to a 6. And that's going to soak up a ton of damage from the villain when it's attacking you while you're in hero form. So this is a great card. I highly recommend it. This would be something I would look for in my opening draw or my mulligan to try to get this out. It increases the viability of the Groot deck significantly. Because once again, the name of the game is you don't want to lose all your growth counters. If you're getting hit for tons of damage, you're going to lose all your growth counters potentially in one hit. But this is a great way to stay in the game a little bit longer, and you don't lose a lot of growth counters. Another event I want to talk about, there's only one in the Groot deck. This is We Are Groot. This card is also very effective at kind of maintaining your supply of growth counters on Groot. So for just one cost, you can remove up to 4 growth counters from Groot, and you can choose that many friendly characters, and Groot can be included in this. So for just one cost and spending 1 growth counter, you can put a toughness status card on Groot, and that will allow him to soak up a villain attack, unless it has piercing. But for the most part, this is a great way to, let's say, you're playing solo. For just 1 cost and 1 growth counter, you can soak up a full hit. So that's a really great thing to do. Now, spending 4 growth counters, that's pretty hefty, that's pretty heavy. So I don't necessarily recommend spending all that much. You'd have to probably be in some pretty dire circumstances to spend 4 growth counters. And then the one on the right I find is a little bit costly. This is called Lashing Vines. So after Groot uses a basic power, you can remove 2 growth counters from him, and you get to ready Groot, and then you get to use them again. That's pretty good. It just feels a little bit kind of costly to me. So if you're going to be using that, use that sparingly. Otherwise, you're going to eat through all of your growth counters too fast. Next up, we have a set of cards which are, kind of very similar. First one is I Am Groot, all in caps. This one is you're going to deal damage to an enemy equal to the number of growth counters on Groot. What's great about this is you don't have to spend the growth counters, but you have to have them. So if you have 0 growth counters, this card doesn't do anything for you. Consequently, we also have I Am Groot, which is written in smaller letters. This allows you to remove threats from a scheme equal to the number of growth counters on Groot. This can be highly effective, but once again, this card doesn't get you anywhere if you don't have any growth counters. So, let's just recap. Keep the growth counters on Groot to keep him strong and to keep him from, to be able to do things like this. Let's start talking about the different aspects that you can mix with Groot. Obviously, Groot comes as a protection style character, and quite honestly, this is the best way to play Groot. Kind of what I just mentioned is that you want to keep him from losing all his growth counters, and you can do that by making sure that he's not taking a ton of damage. So protection works really well with the Groot character. So, basically your Desperate Defense and your Expert Defense, these are kind of similar. These are cheap events that you can play to kind of boost the defense of your character. So with Groot starting with a 3 defense, and you can then throw this down for an extra 3 to raise him to a 6. And then as we saw before, with some of his other cards that he has in the deck to raise him even further, that Vine Shield card, you could raise him up to a defense of 9 pretty quick. Not many of the villains are going to be able to do much damage to Groot once he has that kind of defense value of 9. So protection aspect decks work really well with Groot. If you're going to put those together, I would stay away from some of the healing cards. Remember that you want to keep Groot from getting hit so you don't have to use that forced interrupt on him. So healing cards really don't work well with Groot. Keep him from soaking up and taking the damage to begin with. Next up is leadership. If you're going to mix the leadership aspect in with Groot, it's going to work remarkably well. And kind of the reasoning behind it is that a lot of times when you're playing leadership decks, you're going to be very ally intensive. You're going to have a decent number of allies to put out onto the table, and they're going to have a mixture of both thwarting and attacking, so it makes your deck very versatile. So instead of having the villain continually punish Groot and you lose those growth counters, you're going to be using your allies to defend those attacks and soak up that damage. So it really allows Groot to kind of do his own thing. He gets to build up a lot of those growth counters, and thus his sort of like special ability cards get to those really high levels. So this is a great way to kind of buffer him. If you're using the leadership aspect, go ahead and just run a ton of allies in the deck. When deck building with justice and aggression aspects, I kind of feel the same way, kind of as I do with the leadership aspect. You want some allies to buffer those hits so you can keep those growth counters up. But kind of what I like about justice and aggression, and that's why I put them on the same sort of video clip, is that if you screw up, let's say, and Groot takes a massive amount of damage and his growth counters get completely depleted, your deck is still going to function pretty well. So if you're running a Justice aspect deck, you're going to have a bunch of events that you can mitigate threat that don't need those growth counters, and consequently, if you're running aggression, you're going to have a lot of those heavy hitting events that you're still going to be able to whittle down the enemy. So what makes this difficult is that if you're in solo mode, playing both Justice and aggression can be very challenging. So I think Groot works pretty well, in a solo mode in protection and leadership. I don't think he works nearly as well in solo mode in Justice and aggression, so I think you're going to have to be a little bit more careful and cautious in your playstyle and your deck building if you're running one of these aspects. Now, if you're doing a nice group player game, and like I said, if you lose all your growth counters and you are kind of playing not the best, during that game, it's not that big of a deal because you can still meet your primary role of either removing threats or dealing damage if you're playing the Justice or aggression aspects. All right, for this deck, I wanted to do something different, and this is something that I do quite a bit when I'm playing with my friends in my gaming group, is that I kind of change up the deck and I use some sort of strange alternate resource combinations. And, for a lot of people, they don't really like that. They like to just kind of play it safe and do the same traditional resources. So kind of for this video, as part of the Groot build, what I wanted to do is show that you could be successful without using any sort of basic resource. So all of these things are pretty typical: energy, genius, and strength. And then you have cards like the power of aggression, and obviously every aspect has the same sort of card. And then Helicarrier and Avengers Mansion. So what I'm going to do is take all of that stuff out. We're going to run a deck with none of that as resources. And I'm going to kind of show you that you could be successful running these alternate resource decks, and you can have a lot of fun doing it. I'm kind of glad the game designers that made Marvel Champions decided to mix things up with Groot. So there's something a little bit subtle in his deck that I kind of want to talk about. 14 of his 15 hero cards all have the superpower keyword actually listed on them. And one thing that I'm super excited about is sort of the addition of this concept of alternate resources, so I'll kind of walk you through what that looks like. The Galaxy's Most Wanted expansion brings this card into play. It's called Deft Focus. This is a kind of cool card. It's a little bit subtle, but I think this really advances the game and really helps you do some alternate deck builds when it comes to resource management. And I'll kind of walk you through that. So as we just saw with Groot, he's got 14 superpower cards in his deck. Now there are other heroes in Marvel Champions that have a lot of different superpower cards in their deck. Quicksilver has a ton of them. Captain Marvel has a decent amount of these. So kind of what's cool about this new expansion is that you can take Deft Focus and use it to bolster and enhance some of your older decks and your sort of classic heroes. This card is fantastic. You can only have one out at a time, but since it's not sort of rare, you can have 3 of them in your deck, obviously. So what this does is it allows you to reduce the cost of the next superpower card you play this turn by 1. So as we saw for Groot, that's a huge advantage to playing almost any of his hero cards. Quicksilver is going to be the same way, and what makes Quicksilver even crazier is a lot of his cards are super cheap to begin with. So you can literally get a lot of this stuff down even lower and to basically negligible levels. And think about it with Captain Marvel as well. She has a lot of superpower cards. So kind of what I'm doing with Groot is we're going to put some of these Deft Focus cards in, which is great because it comes in the Galaxy's Most Wanted expansion. And then we're going to mix some other cards in as opposed to basic resources to kind of get him to where he needs to go. So here's what we can do to kind of play around with some alternate resources. So on the left, obviously, I have Deft Focus. In the middle, I have an attack superpower. And then on the right, I have this Martial Prowess card. So this is capped at 1 per player. This is capped at 1 per player. But what I can do is I can use a combination of these in the deck to kind of give me a consistent amount of resource generation every turn. Obviously, if I have the resources that I play and they go into my discard pile, I'm going to have bursts of resources throughout the course of the game. So maybe you're the type of player that just wants a better, more consistent resource load, and this is something that you can do. So just by having these 2 upgrades out, you can play this Root Stomp for free on your turn. So you're going to reduce it by 1, and then you're going to get this resource and then pay for it. So you're not losing any cards from your hand, and it allows you to be a little bit more versatile. Now, what's cool about this idea, the designers of this game have been slowly adding these cards in. So there's, here's an example of one from the protection class, and then here's one from the justice aspect as well. So you can see it's the same thing. It's max 1 per player, and you're generating resources for either a thwart event or a defense event. So kind of what's fun about this game, kind of bend and change your thinking on how you put decks together, and resource management is one of those things that you can alter and you can make it effective. So the deck that I'm going to show you that I built with Groot, it's going to be an aggression deck, and I'm going to be using these combinations in the deck, and it actually works pretty well. Here's the Groot aggression deck build. Feel free to simply pause the video and take a look at the cards that are being used. And as always, if you see something that you want to swap out or change out, feel free to do that. I'm using certain allies. You might like other allies instead. But kind of the goal of this is to mix in those altered sort of resource cards. So we've got Def Focus and Martial Prowess at the top. And then we're going to be playing a lot of aggression cards, so Martial Prowess will allow us to play those aggression cards for just a little bit cheaper, because it's going to give us that resource. So we're going to have 12 total aggression events in there, and just a few allies to soak up damage so Groot isn't being brutalized the entire time. And then same thing on the basic side, we're going to throw some sort of like basic allies in there as well. Downtime and endurance for survival, and it's a pretty simple deck. But feel free to just modify it as you wish, and because that's the fun of deck building games. To play this deck effectively, remember to use your Fruition, Fertile Ground, and Root Stomps to consistently and keep building up those growth counters. Use your growth counters sparingly. To use your special abilities specifically, you want to be focusing on Vine Shield. Vine Shield is a great way to soak up damage if the villain attacks you, giving you a 6 defense, and not allowing you to lose a bunch of those growth counters. So once you keep the sort of forward progression with the growth counters on you, you are going to assault the villain and the minions endlessly with Into the Fray, Drop Kick, Piercing Strike, and Melee. So you're going to have 12 of these attack cards in your deck, and basically once a turn, you're going to be hitting the villain or minions with this and just keep chipping and whittling them down. The one thing that can be a little bit of an issue with this deck is threat mitigation. So what I like to do is throw in 3 copies of To the Rescue. This is just a basic card that allows you to chip away 2 threat from any scheme, and it's pretty fast and easy to play. Now, obviously, when you're playing Groot, he works very well if he's in a group setting, specifically with the aggression and the justice lines. He has a little bit of a difficulty sort of playing solo mode with these 2 different aspects. He's very strong with the leadership aspect and probably the strongest with the protection aspect, and you can play those decks either way, whether solo or in a group match. I want to thank you today for joining me for this Groot deck building video. Hopefully you've seen some cool tips and tricks when you build your own Groot deck. In addition, think about those alternate resources that you can use. You might be getting a little bit tired of using the basic resources after this game has been out for quite a while. So I encourage you to try out those alternate resource strategies. They're actually quite a bit of fun and they're pretty effective. Thanks again, and as always, have fun gaming.